Hello and welcome to the How to Get an Analytics Job podcast, where we will help you discover where you fit into the analytics marketplace, what skills you should build, and how to land your analytics dream job. I'm John David, analytics agency owner and educator.
And I'm Elizabeth Illig, a private career coach and higher education professional. In this podcast, we will not only help you land your next analytics job, but we will give you the tools and strategies to level up your career. Hi everyone, I am Elizabeth Illig. This week, we are bringing back Bridget Holcombe, who you may remember from episode 17. And Bridget is going to be chatting with us about personal and behavioral interviews. So Bridget is phenomenal in this topic, y'all. She is great at helping applicants, clients, students communicate their value to an employer. So Bridget, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So if we could start by having you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do, that would be great.
My background is primarily in college career centers, including 4 years as the director of a college career center. And I also have a private practice, which is targeted more at young professionals, basically career coaching for anyone who has a need. But I've kind of found a niche, the young professionals who are maybe 2 to 3 years out of school and transitioning out of that first job.
Wonderful. As I mentioned, we are going to dive into personal and behavioral interviews today. We are in our interviewing theme this month, and so we've already talked about financial interviews and Tableau interviews. So Bridget is going to provide us with more of that personal and behavioral interview advice. So let's dive in with sort of an overview question, which is, what are employers looking for anyway when they're interviewing candidates?
That's actually a really important question to consider, because what a lot of folks don't realize is if they are at the interview, they've already passed the first test, if you will. So the employer has looked at their resume and feels like they have the necessary skills. And so a lot of interviews are more focused on getting to know you, even though they will still be structured and have the formal questions. But some of the themes that employers are thinking about when they're interviewing you are, did you spend time learning about us? Did you research us? What do you know about our business? Do you have the right personality for our culture? Will you fit? Are you a match? Do you listen well and answer the questions during the interview? Again, are you an active listener? What are your communication skills like? Do you know your resume? Can you talk about anything and everything that's on your resume in detail and tell an interesting story? And then I think probably the most important thing is, would I like to work with you? Would I like for you to come here to my place of business and be a part of my team? Mm-hmm. And who are you really? Who are you as a person? I want to see the real you.
Right.
And I think sometimes applicants get so caught up in what they're going to say for their answers, they forget to be themselves. And it's really important to get that cultural fit right, that you show your true self, your best true self, granted.
Right. Yes, I see this a lot in interviews, and people get really nervous, so maybe they are not showing that side of themselves that they want to show. But employers want to know that you are somebody they will like, that they will want to work with you, that you're a cultural fit, in addition to those skills and that you mentioned, Bridget, that you need to showcase the skills and experiences that you have. So as a business analytics professional or somebody who's interested in that field, I feel like these folks encounter so many different types of interviews, both in format and in content. So what are the different types of interviews that a business analytics applicant will encounter?
Well, a new trend that has really gained popularity is the one-way recorded video interview. And these can be very awkward because there isn't anybody on the other side. You're basically recording yourself answering questions, prompts. And you have to get comfortable with that. You have to learn how to position your computer so that you're looking directly at the camera. And it's very unnatural, but from the employer perspective, it's a very cost-effective way to do first-round interviews. If you think about it, a phone interview, the employer has to commit probably anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes with that candidate. Compared to a recorded video interview, you can decide within 5 minutes if you want to listen to the rest of it.
Yes.
I know that sounds kind of cold, but that is the way it works. And oftentimes, that is the first step to even getting a phone interview. And for a phone interview, you have the advantage of being able to have your notes, your resume in front of you, any little reminders, but you don't have the power of your smile or your eye contact. And so it's really important to project energy and to watch your tone. I tell clients to stand when they're doing a phone interview.
Interesting.
That may not work for everyone, and I also tell them to dress the part of the interview.
Well, there's always that concern that they're going to stand up and they're going to be wearing their pajama bottoms on this video interview, which we highly
Right.
do not recommend
Right.
that you do.
But even for a phone interview, to put on something at least business casual that makes you feel like a professional can have a really subtle effect on your confidence, which is going to come through.
Yes.
And it's also important to remember that these early round interviews are often conducted by the Human Resources Department. So they may have a standard list of questions that they're required to ask all applicants. So it's going to be somewhat boilerplate. And you have to also be comfortable with silence, because that person on the other end in a phone interview is writing notes. And we have a tendency to not like silence and to want to fill it with the sound of our own voice. So you have to get comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm. You're right about that. It certainly is a tendency for applicants to just continue talking, and it might be better to just end that conversation and let that person absorb what you've had to say and then move on to the next question. So we do have that tendency to want to fill silence.
And then beyond those early screening types of interviews, there's obviously the in-person interviews. So that could be one-on-one. It could be a panel interview where there are multiple people interviewing you, or it could be a group interview where you're being interviewed as part of a team or asked to do a team project in front of an employer. So those are some different types of interviews, but the traditional one, of course, is one-on-one, face-to-face. And at that point, it's really hard to know what to expect, because there's no universal style of interviewing. So you have to kind of be prepared for anything. We can't know in advance the skill level of the person who's interviewing you. And sometimes you may have prepared and then come back and you'll say to me, it was just a conversation, getting to know each other. Well, that's fine, but the fact that you were prepared, what if it hadn't been that kind of interview?
Right.
You can't take the chance. So that's part of the challenge of one-on-one interviews, is just maintaining your poise and being able to adjust to whatever is going on in the room.
Right. And you'll find some interviewers are very conversational, very talkative, and others are not. Others are those stone-faced people that you really don't know how your answer is landing. This is how I got my first job. The person that interviewed me was so stone-faced that I thought I had bombed it. I thought, well, I don't know. I thought I answered the questions pretty well, but he did not respond at all. They hired me. He just had that demeanor.
That's the worst. And then there's also when employers do that intentionally, we call that a stress interview.
Right.
And they want to see if you crack under pressure, or how you deal with an aggressive interviewer.
Right.
Maybe cutting you off in the middle of your response to tell me about yourself.
Yeah, how would you deal with a hostile interviewer? Yes.
Right.
I mean, that is important for every one of you to be thinking about, because you could meet the nicest, most talkative, friendly person, or you could meet the hostile interviewer.
And then a lot of times we hear interviews described or labeled as behavioral interviews. And to be honest, most interviews have a behavioral component to them where you're going to get asked a question. Tell me about a time when ... Give me an example of when ... And these are just questions that ask you to give an example from a previous experience of how you handled something. And it gives the employer some insight into how you might handle that situation if you work for them.
Right. So that is great. We've covered different types of interviews, what our applicants can maybe anticipate, how to prepare for a number of things that may be happening in format and the type of person who interviews you. And I want to dive into that a little bit more. What are your recommended strategies to prepare for interviews?
There's a lot of work that goes into preparing for an interview, and most people don't realize that. And the ones who invest time in preparing are going to be the ones who land the job. So the very first thing is to review the job description and come away with a clear understanding of what that employer is looking for. I like to highlight keywords in a job description, and that's kind of my starting point when I'm working with a student or a client, so that we are focusing on those things and shifting away from the applicant thinking about what they want to talk about in the interview. I think it's also important to review the company website to see if these themes pop up. Read their mission statement, their values, blog posts, things like that, just to get an overall sense of what the company values. Then a really powerful thing to do is to find someone at that organization with whom you can conduct an informational interview, which is really just a casual conversation, finding out what it's like to work there. You're not asking for a job, you're not asking for help, but you're getting some ideas about what it actually looks like from the employer perspective. That's very, very powerful. And I mentioned looking at blog posts, also reading, and I'm talking about the day of, up to the day, and including the day of the interview, reading news, making sure you know what's going on. Has there been a big press release? Reviewing the company bios on the website and LinkedIn profiles of people you're going to be interviewing with. A lot of my students enjoy going to glassdoor.com to research interview questions that they can expect. And for the bigger companies, especially the human resources early stage interviews, a lot of times there are very common threads and you can get a sense for what you're going to get asked in the interview. So that can be very powerful. And then to answer behavioral questions, you have to have stories that are very impactful. And when you think about all the themes of these types of questions, they could be teamwork, leadership, problem solving, failure. It's hard to come up with a story for each one. So what I like to do is start with the stories, build the stories, have 5 to 6 really good examples, stories, including a failure story, and then think about how you could use them in an interview. So you might be able to use a story in multiple ways. You're only going to share it once during the interview, but it could answer one of many questions. That's really important. And of course, we recommend the STAR formula, which I know you're very familiar with.
I love the STAR formula.
Situation, task, action, result. And a common mistake I see there is focusing too much on the setup.
Mm-hmm. And not getting to the result.
Not getting to the specific actions that you took and the result, the lesson learned, how you've changed going forward. And during interview prep, I will cut someone off if they're going too long. It sounds mean, but I will stop them if they're spending too long in the setup. I just want to create a little. I want a client to paint a picture of the situation so that I can picture what's going on, and even create a little drama around it. There's the storytelling piece, but then quickly get to what he or she specifically did.
Right. What was the action that you took, and the result that came from that action to resolve whatever this was. And when we talk about behavioral interviews, I realize that maybe we might need to define that a little bit. These are the questions that you will receive that say something like, tell me about a time when, fill in the blank. So it could be, tell me about a time when you failed. Tell me about a time when you used your analytical skills to solve a problem. Tell me about a time when you worked on a team. So it's asking you to look at your past experience because that is predictive of your future experience. And it isn't just a story like you would tell to a friend. You really do want to be targeted in what you say. And as Bridget mentioned, the STAR method is a great way to do that. Situation, task, action, result. So that's what we mean when we talk about behavioral interviews. I think many of the things you mentioned are wonderful ways to prepare. I would add that sometimes I tell students and clients to practice in the mirror or practice with a family member or a friend. I don't care if you have stuffed animals, practice to them. Practice on your way driving to the interview. People will think that you're just on the phone in your car. But make sure that you practice aloud your answers. I think that's an excellent way for you to feel comfortable with the questions that you may be receiving.
And I would add to that, because practice is extremely important, practice and time yourself so you have a sense for whether you are going on too long, and record yourself, catch those filler words like so, and make sure you're not rambling. If you can stand to watch a video of yourself, you'll catch some gestures that are maybe distracting. It's painful, but very, very powerful.
Yes. And really, when we're thinking about answers, about 2 minutes is the norm of how long you want to spend. So we often encounter clients who maybe are on one side of the spectrum. They give the one-word answer, or they're very chatty and they give a 10-minute answer, and the interviewer has now lost the thread of this.
Right.
So wherever you fall, be aware of that, and be aware that you may have to bulk up your answer, or you may have to shed some things and edit your answer a little bit.
And that is a really good point. I tell people all the time there's a sweet spot. The extroverted people tend to ramble and not get to the point, not be concise, and then more introverted people tend to not give enough information, and there's a sweet spot right in the middle that you've got to find. So everyone, I think a lot of times more reserved people think that super extroverted people have it made when it comes to interviewing, but actually a lot of extroversion can be a handicap in an interview, and maybe you're not listening carefully and tend to ramble. So everyone can benefit from coaching,
right,
for interviews.
I am just picturing Bridget, because I have been in some of her sessions, her coaching sessions, and she will give the timeout sign to an applicant, to a student or a client, and she will say, just time out. You have been talking for 7 minutes now.
True.
Let's move on.
Story.
Let's talk about how we can pull this
story.
down. Yes. So there definitely is a sweet spot somewhere in the middle between talking too much and not talking enough. I am curious about common questions. So there are a lot of interviewing questions out there, but what are some of the common ones that you are seeing? And I think the question behind the question is another thing I'm interested in. So what are those questions really asking?
My strategy approaching interviews is to teach students and clients the strategy of interviewing. So the first thing I tell them is learn to recognize the type of question, which is really speaking to what you're asking. Why am I being asked that question? So generally speaking, there's going to be an open-ended question of some sort. Tell me about yourself is probably the most common, but it could also look like this. What interests you about this position? Walk me through your resume. And I think there, again, this is a lot about your verbal communication skills and your personality, and just seeing how you communicate. Are you an effective communicator? Every employer out there values communication skills. So seeing if you can deliver a message and are well spoken, as opposed to really the content of the answer. Because remember, they have your resume. They've already reviewed your resume. That's why you're there.
Right.
So to me, this question is more about your communication skills and being able to deliver an impactful message in a short amount of time, as you mentioned, 2 minutes.
Right.
And then another category would be a strengths-based question, and that could be as simple as, what are 3 words that describe you? Or how would your former employer or your college professors describe you? And everyone should have at the ready 3 really great words or phrases that they really, really own and believe about themselves, and make the language interesting. Words like motivated, there's so many overused buzzwords, so try to come up with some interesting things. And if you're having trouble, ask someone who knows you well. We, of course, also use the Clifton Strengths Assessment to get at those concepts. But a lot of questions are going to be around strengths. Even, why should we hire you over other candidates? That's a strengths question, and you should prepare that answer, or be prepared to answer that from a strengths perspective. And this is what we call the humble brag, and I know a lot of people struggle with this. College students really struggle with this. And so I have to teach them, this isn't bragging, it's just confidently talking about what you know you do well. And sometimes it can be more comfortable to say, well, people often describe me as, or my boss last summer said this about me, and sometimes that can help deflect some of that awkwardness for the person giving that answer. You should always know how to answer what is your greatest weakness, or something around weakness, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We've talked about behavioral questions, and it's really, really important to have a failure story. Those are being asked for in interviews more and more, testing for resilience. And then situational questions. So we talked about behavioral questions are around the belief that past behavior predicts future behavior. So situational questions are a little bit different. These are hypotheticals. And so an employer there is looking at your judgment, how you would handle a problem, maybe some ethical kind of considerations. What is your personal code of ethics, that sort of thing. And then, what do you know about our company? They want to know that you did some research.
Right. That you're excited about them.
That you're excited, that you show some energy around what they do, their product or whatever. And I tell students all the time, whoever you're in front of for the interview, you are all about that employer.
Right. They are your top choice.
They are your top choice during the interview.
You're exactly right. Yes. I am glad you mentioned the weakness question, because this is by far something that we get asked all the time. How do I answer the weakness question? Should I just spin it into a strength and pretend like I don't have a weakness? Am I too perfectionistic? Is that what I should say? Please don't say that. Please don't say that. So what are your best strategies for answering the what is your greatest weakness question?
I actually love helping people formulate an answer to this.
Do you? This is one of your favorite things?
I don't know why, but I love this. So we know obviously that we all have things that we're working on. So the first thing you do is you don't give an answer that is a characteristic important to this job. So you have to be smart about it. So you've read the job description. If the job calls for a lot of public speaking, you're not going to say, I'm terrible at public speaking.
Right.
So you want to, first of all, identify something that isn't your strong suit, but that is not particularly relevant to the job you're interviewing for. And then I also hate to hear a response that starts with, well, my greatest weakness is... No, it needs to be framed like this. Well, something I've been working on, or something I've committed to improving is, and framing it in positive language, and then talking about the steps that you're taking to make that improvement and any recent successes. I think that helps a lot, and I just hate using the word weakness. Even if the question comes out that way, I don't ever want to hear a response that includes that word.
Right. It's reframing it to say, here's something I'm trying to develop. And you can give specific examples. So if public speaking is the thing you're going to talk about because the job does not require you to public speak, then you can say, listen, I am somebody who has been trying to improve my public speaking abilities. I purposely enrolled in a class where I would speak 5 times during the semester, and doing that has taught me to be much more confident in my public speaking abilities. So you're giving concrete examples of how you've started to improve this particular quote-unquote weakness that you've identified.
And when you asked earlier about the reasoning behind these questions, for me, the reason this question gets asked, superficially, you could say the employer wants to make sure that you don't have a weakness in an area that matters to them. But I think the real meaning of this, the real purpose of this question is to see how real you are and how authentic you are. So this can be a really important question in the interview. You don't want to have a canned, I got this off the internet type of response like you alluded to earlier about, oh, I'm a perfectionist. I care too much. I take on too many things. And so this is a way for an employer to see the real you and to see a little bit of humility and self-awareness, which is really important.
Right. I think the self-awareness is key. And as you mentioned, the humility bit is good for employers to see as well. So one thing that I think sometimes applicants are not thinking about, but I want them to be aware of, is that they have the opportunity to ask questions of the interviewer. So what are some strong questions that applicants can ask?
This will really depend on the interview and what has been discussed. I recommend going into an interview with 5 or 6 questions listed, because you have to consider the fact that you might get an answer to one of the questions you were planning to ask during the interview. So if you go in with 2 or 3 and think, oh, I've got 2 or 3 great questions, and those all through conversation have already been answered, then at the end, you're kind of stuck. So you obviously don't want to ask anything that you should already know, meaning anything that's in the marketing materials, the application materials that you've been given, anything you can find on the website. And you always want to close by asking about next steps and when you can expect to hear. But before that, I think it really just depends on the person. You can ask a more in-depth question about something that you've learned during the interview. You can ask about a current initiative that the organization is involved in. You can ask about engagement in the community, sustainability, something that's important to you. Don't just ask to ask, but think about something that you care about. A lot of college students today do a lot in the community, do a lot of volunteer work, and so they might ask about opportunities to engage in some of the community activities that the company sponsors. You can always ask personal, career-related questions, personal questions of the interviewer. So you've reviewed their LinkedIn profiles, and you might say, well, I noticed that you formerly worked at Marriott and made the shift to Hilton. How do those two compare, and what caused you to come over to Hilton? People love to talk about themselves, and that can really build rapport. But there are all kinds of questions out there that you can ask. There
are some really good options, and I think it's smart to be thinking about who's the person who's interviewing you, what is on and available on the internet that you can already do the research on, so that you're not just asking a question that's readily available. And some of the ones that I've seen that if they haven't been answered that I really recommend are, what's a typical day in the life like for this particular person, this role, and what is expected of me in the first 30, 60, or 90 days.
I love that one.
That's such a good one, because it speaks to, I am here to understand what the expectations are, and I want to deliver on those.
And it's also just showing confidence and that you can see yourself in the position, and you're already asking questions about how to be successful. Another one related to that might be asking about how you will receive feedback and opportunities for improving, mentoring, things like that, which we know those are themes that are really important to both employers and to young professionals today.
Right. Just as you mentioned, the volunteering could be important to you, so the mentorship could be a very important aspect that you want to ask them about. Mm-hmm. We are going to wrap up this discussion with next steps. So I think something that I often advise clients and students to do is send a thank you note, follow up, but they don't always do it. They don't always do it.
That's a huge mistake.
Yeah. So what would you recommend as next steps after an interview?
The very first thing I would do after an interview is once you've left the building, find a quiet space and write down everything that you remember from the interview. You may think that you'll remember what was talked about, but you won't. Write it all down, and that way you can remember who said what and what particular point a particular person made that was impactful to you. And then you're going to send a thank you email. And I get asked this all the time. Can I just send one email to the 3 people I met? No. Individual emails that reference something that you talked about in your conversation with that person. That is so powerful. And even though I love handwritten thank you notes, we live in a digital world and people are moving fast. There could be a meeting at 4:00 the afternoon that you have interviewed to make a decision about who to move forward. You don't want to wait for snail mail to get your handwritten note through. If you're doing an informational interview, a handwritten thank you note is a nice touch after something like that. But for a high stakes interview, I like to see a thank you email sent that same day.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And as we talked about, when you are leaving that interview, one of your last questions is going to be, what are the next steps? What's the hiring timeline? When should I expect to hear from you?
Right.
And then you may even say, okay, great. Well, then I will plan to follow up with you after that timeline. So if they say, we're going to make a decision in 2 weeks, you can say, great, I will follow up with you then. So then you have that set in place and it doesn't feel weird or awkward when you do follow up.
And also putting a note on your calendar as a reminder, because 2 weeks can go by in a blur. And I've had students come to me and say, they told me I would hear in 2 weeks. And when I ask the student how long it's been, they'll look at their calendar and say, well, now it's been a month. Mm-hmm. So calendar reminders are huge.
Yes, it's important for you to continue to follow up. I mean, don't be annoying, but follow up in 2 weeks. If not before, if they said there was an earlier timeline, and make a note on your calendar to do so.
And always remind the interviewer at the end of the interview and in your thank you how much you want the job.
Right.
Don't be afraid to ask for the job. You know, I know there are a lot of people that have these kind of sales techniques. Is there any reason why you wouldn't hire me after what you've learned about me today during this interview? That type of approach is not for everyone, but certainly let them know how excited you are about the position, the opportunity, and that you would be thrilled to join the team.
Absolutely.
And say it, write it in your thank you email, make it very clear.
Yes, you're right. Say it at the end of the interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to interview me. I remain incredibly interested in this position, and I'm excited about next steps. And then say it again in your thank you note. And phrase it however you want to phrase it. If you are that salesperson, fine. If you are not, you can phrase it very nicely, as I just did. So phrase it whatever way makes you the most comfortable.
And be authentic.
Right.
Be yourself.
Be yourself. I don't know that I would say what would prevent you from hiring me today.
I can't see you saying that. I wouldn't say that either, but
right.
If you're interviewing for a sales job,
it might work.
That oftentimes is a good strategy.
Right, exactly right. So that really wraps up our episode on personal and behavioral interviews. So this is the last episode in our interviewing theme, and we're going to move to the leveling up theme next time. So you will hear from John David and me about leveling up. For now, thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to you tuning in next week.